Most people know MacArthur as a fearless legend, but only a few know the day when the unstoppable general was challenged not by an enemy, but by Dwight D. Eisenhower himself. Eisenhower looked him directly in the eye and refused to obey. What came after those words shook the entire U.S. military command to its core. This is the story of two America's most legendary military figures, General Douglas MacArthur and General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Is a story carved into the steel frame of history. It is a story of power, pride, rivalry, and leadership under impossible pressure. Both men rose from humble beginnings. Both led armies in the greatest conflicts humanity had ever seen. And both changed the direction of the world. Yet beneath their uniforms, beneath the medals shining on their chests, there was a tension that simmered for decades. It was a tension born not on the battlefield, but in rooms filled with maps and orders, where decisions could shape the fate of nations with the stroke of a pen. And the most explosive moment between them came when Eisenhower made a choice MacArthur never expected. He refused an order. To understand the magnitude of that moment, we must begin long before the conflict. Long before, MacArthur and Eisenhower stood on opposite ends of authority. In their early years, Eisenhower served under MacArthur. He was a young officer then, quiet, disciplined, eager to learn. MacArthur, already a towering figure, carried himself as if destiny itself followed him. Every step he took shook the ground. Every word he spoke commanded silence. He believed in greatness as a birthright, and he expected and questioned obedience. Eisenhower, meanwhile, saw greatness differently. He believed leadership was not about domination, but about earning respect through humility and steady resolve. When Eisenhower first worked as MacArthur's aide in the Philippines before the Second World War, he respected the general deeply. He admired MacArthur's courage, his strategic mind, and his ability to inspire devotion in men who would follow him into fire. But Eisenhower also saw something others were afraid to acknowledge: the dangerous edge of MacArthur's pride. He watched MacArthur speak with absolute certainty, refusing disagreement, convinced he alone understood the future of war and politics. The more Eisenhower witnessed, the more he understood that power without restraint could destroy everything it touches. As time passed, Eisenhower grew tired of the constant clashes of personality. MacArthur demanded obedience. Eisenhower demanded logic. One day, exhausted and frustrated, Eisenhower returned to his quarters and slammed his fist on the table, saying aloud, not caring who heard, "I studied dramatics under MacArthur for 5 years. He has a tough audience in me." It was a moment that revealed the friction burning quietly beneath the surface. Yet Eisenhower never disrespected him publicly. He remained loyal, professional, and committed to duty. But under the uniform, he began to realize that the day might come when he would need to stand against a man he once followed. That day came during the Korean War, a time when the world trembled on the knife edge between hope and annihilation. The Cold War cast long shadows across every continent. Nations held their breath, terrified that a spark could ignite a global firestorm. And into this storm stepped General Douglas MacArthur, once again commanding armies with his trademark intensity and unshakable confidence. He saw Korea not as a regional conflict, but as the moment to strike boldly against communism with overwhelming force. He wanted total victory, no matter the cost. He wanted China confronted, borders crossed, threats crushed. But the White House feared that such actions would unleash another World War I that could end millions of lives in nuclear fire. President Truman and his advisors believed in caution. They believed diplomacy must walk alongside strategy, and at their side, guiding military judgment with calm clarity, stood Eisenhower. He was not yet president, not yet the celebrated leader of a nation, but he held immense influence as the supreme allied commander in Europe and one of the most trusted voices in matters of war. Truman relied on him to balance emotional impulse with rational discipline. He trusted Eisenhower to prevent decisions driven by pride instead of reason. MacArthur, however, felt the opposite. He believed Truman and his advisors were weak, He believed that hesitation would embolden enemies. The two visions collided violently, and Eisenhower suddenly stood between a commander who demanded compliance and a government that demanded restraint. And then came the moment that changed everything. MacArthur issued an order that would escalate the conflict dramatically and risk-provoking China into full-scale war. He expected immediate action. He expected loyalty from everyone beneath him. But Eisenhower refused to support the order. He refused not out of disrespect, but out of duty. He knew that what MacArthur proposed could spiral into disaster, that millions could die, that the world could slip into a darkness from which it might never recover. Eisenhower did something few dared. He said no to Douglas MacArthur. The reaction was volcanic. When the message reached MacArthur, the room fell silent. Officers who stood near him later recalled that his face froze, turning pale with shock before flushing with fury. He slammed his hand against the table so hard that papers scattered through the air. His voice rose, trembling not with fear, but with rage. "Who does he think he is?" he demanded. "I have commanded armies before he ever wore stars on his shoulders." The silence that followed felt like the air before a storm breaks. To MacArthur, Eisenhower's refusal was not merely disagreement. It was betrayal. He felt disrespected, challenged, undermined. He believed history had chosen him to shape the world, and anyone who stood in his way threatened destiny itself. He paced the room back and forth like a caged lion, muttering under his breath. The officers present felt the intensity of a storm building. And then MacArthur spoke the words that would echo through history. "Eisenhower is not a soldier. He is a politician in uniform." Those words were more than an insult. They were a declaration of war between two titans of American military leadership. MacArthur believed Eisenhower had abandoned loyalty for ambition, that Eisenhower refused the order to protect his political future rather than to protect the world. The bitterness in his voice cut like a blade, and every syllable carried years of unspoken rivalry. MacArthur continued, his voice sharp, "He will destroy everything we have fought for because he is afraid to act." But MacArthur was wrong. Eisenhower refused because he understood something MacArthur never fully accepted. That war is not won by pride or by proving one's strength. War is won by knowing when to fight and when to step back. Eisenhower believed that a leader's duty was not to satisfy ego, but to protect lives. And deep down, beneath the anger and wounded pride, MacArthur knew that Eisenhower's decision threatened the foundation of his identity. He could not bear the idea that someone he once commanded now held the power to deny his will. Rumors of the confrontation spread quickly through military corridors. Officers whispered nervously about the growing rift. Soldiers in the field felt the tension, sensing that something enormous was unfolding above them. The bond of unity that held American leadership together trembled. For the first time, the world saw cracks in the armor of the heroes who had once marched shoulder to shoulder. MacArthur, unwilling to be silenced, began speaking openly, criticizing the administration, challenging authority, forcing the conflict into public view. And Eisenhower, with the restraint that defined him, said nothing. He stayed above the storm, refusing to speak a word against MacArthur. But silence did not mean weakness. It meant discipline. It meant he chose dignity over chaos. The clash between these two men was more than a disagreement. It was a struggle between two visions of the world. MacArthur saw war as destiny. Eisenhower saw it as tragedy. MacArthur believed in victory at any cost. Eisenhower believed victory meant nothing if the world burned afterward. And the world watched, holding its breath, wondering which path would prevail. But the story is far from over. Because what MacArthur said, next the words he unleashed when the consequences of Eisenhower's refusal became unavoidable, would shake the foundation of American history and end the career of one of the most powerful generals the country had ever known. The tension inside the command headquarters that afternoon was heavy enough to feel like the air itself had weight. Eisenhower stood at the long hardwood table, both hands resting flat against the surface as if he were physically carrying the burden of the war. Spread across the table were battle maps, marked with red lines of danger and blue paths of hope. each symbol representing thousands of men depending on the decisions made in that room. The officers around him stood rigid and silent, sensing something monumental was unfolding. Across from him paced General Douglas MacArthur, his boots hitting the floor in sharp, impatient strikes. His posture radiated controlled fury. To those watching, it appeared like two great storm fronts were closing in on each other, destined to collide. They were men of the same nation, the same uniform, and the same sworn duty, yet they now stood on opposite sides of conviction. Moments earlier, Eisenhower had done the unthinkable. He had refused to follow MacArthur's direct order. For a second, the words hung in the air like an echo. Nobody believed they had heard correctly. Eisenhower's voice had been calm, resolute, and unshaken, but the message carried the weight of a battlefield explosion. MacArthur stopped pacing and turned sharply, his eyes burning with disbelief. His voice struck the room like thunder, trapped inside stone walls as he demanded, "General Eisenhower, do you understand the consequences of refusing the orders of your superior?" Shock rippled through the room. Every officer felt their breath catch. Yet Eisenhower did not move, did not tremble, did not retreat. He lifted his chin slightly, speaking with unwavering calm. "Yes, sir, I understand fully, but I cannot follow an order that I believe will cost thousands of American lives unnecessarily." MacArthur stared at him, unable to mask the hurt beneath his anger. Pride, loyalty, sacrifice. All of it seemed to ignite inside him at once. He stepped closer, voice trembling with emotion, as he said, "I have spent my entire life preparing for moments like this. I have carried the American flag across oceans. I have bled for it. I have buried men whose names the world will never remember. And now you tell me that you, a man who once served beneath me, will decide when I am wrong?" Every word hit the room with a force that felt almost physical. Eisenhower's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady as he responded, "This is not about pride. This is about judgment. If we rush forward now, we risk everything. Leadership means protecting the living before honoring the dead." MacArthur's eyes narrowed, his voice turning sharp and cold, though beneath it lay undeniable pain. "And what do you think leadership is to me, Ike? Leadership is not fear. Leadership is not hesitation. Leadership is daring to do what others are too afraid to attempt." The silence that followed felt suffocating. It was more than a disagreement, it was a clash between two philosophies, two hearts, two definitions of courage. Eisenhower believed victory came through careful planning, unity, and minimizing loss. MacArthur believed victory belonged to those who struck boldly, without hesitation. Two men, two roads, one war. Then came the moment that echoed through history. MacArthur stepped close enough that only inches separated the two generals, and said slowly, each word landing like a hammer, "You may have the authority today, Dwight, but history will judge which one of us was truly right. Do not mistake caution for wisdom. Destiny favors the bold." Officers looked away, pretending to inspect their maps, though their eyes were unfocused. No one dared breathe. Eisenhower met MacArthur's eyes with the calm that cut deeper than argument. In a voice barely above a whisper, but strong enough to fill the room, he replied, "History does not belong to the bold, General. It belongs to those who choose humanity over glory." The words struck MacArthur harder than any insult ever could. His lips tightened, and for the first time, doubt flickered across his face, swift, fragile, and painful. He turned abruptly, his coat swinging sharply behind him, and walked toward the door. At the threshold he stopped, refusing to turn, but forcing every man in the room to hear him. His voice dropped into a low, heavy tone that carried like a prophecy. "Mark my words, Eisenhower. The world will remember this moment. If you are wrong, the price will be written in blood, and history will ask why you hesitated when victory stood waiting." The door closed behind him with a sound that felt like a cannon firing. No applause, no arguments, no movement followed. Eisenhower remained motionless, staring at the maps before him, but his eyes seemed fixed not on ink and paper, but on the thousands of young soldiers whose fates were tied to his judgment. He exhaled slowly, like a man carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken prayers, and in that instant, Everyone watching understood something they had never seen before. Leadership is lonely. Leadership is choosing between what is right and what is easy, between saving pride and saving lives. It was in that silence that the war quietly changed direction, not with gunfire, but with the decision that would reshape history. And though no one spoke it aloud, every man in that room knew one truth. This conflict between Eisenhower and MacArthur was far from over. The world was about to witness what happened when two giants refused to step aside. The days following the confrontation between General Douglas MacArthur and General Dwight D. Eisenhower unfolded like the slow tension of a storm that refused to release its rain. Word of what had happened spread quietly through the ranks, not as gossip, but as a whispered legend. Soldiers in the field felt the tremor even though they did not know the details. Officers walked more carefully. Every decision, every command, every silence seemed heavier than before. Eisenhower carried on with his responsibilities, but those who observed him closely saw a subtle change in his demeanor. He was always calm, always composed, but now there was a weight behind his eyes, a loneliness that could only come from knowing that leadership sometimes demands choices that break the heart of the one who makes them. He had not simply disagreed with MacArthur, he had taken a step that could alter the course of the war, the reputation of the army, and his own future. Yet he remained steady, fully aware that history watches quietly before it speaks loudly. MacArthur, meanwhile, returned to his quarters in silence, his steps heavy with emotion he could not show. For years, he had lived with an unwavering certainty in his destiny, with a belief that he was chosen to carve American triumph into the stone of history. He carried medals, honors, victories, and scars that testified to his courage, but never before had he been challenged so directly by a man he had once mentored, guided, and shaped. He felt betrayed, misunderstood, and disrespected, not merely as a general, but as a symbol. In his private moments, the anger burned deeply. He replayed Eisenhower's words in his mind. History belongs to those who choose humanity over glory. To MacArthur, it felt like a judgment, like someone had struck the core of his identity. He believed without hesitation that bold action was the only way to win a war. That hesitation was the enemy of victory. And now, for the first time, he wondered whether the world was changing faster than he was. The political and military world reacted quickly. Washington was shaken. Advisors whispered in corners, trying to understand whether this was merely a disagreement or the beginning of an ideological fracture inside the command. Some believed MacArthur was right, that decisive force wins wars and saves lives in the long run. Others supported Eisenhower's reasoning that strategy, patience, and careful planning prevented unnecessary sacrifice. Newspaper journalists caught rumors but found no confirmation. No one dared publish speculative headlines. The public would learn only what time chose to reveal. The president himself became involved, watching closely, understanding that two of the greatest military leaders America had ever produced now stood divided, not by loyalty, but by philosophy, and both believed they were protecting their country. Days later, Arthur requested a private conversation with Eisenhower, a meeting many feared would worsen the divide. But when Eisenhower walked through the door, something unexpected happened. MacArthur did not explode in anger, did not deliver accusations, did not raise his voice. Instead, he looked at Eisenhower with a mixture of exhaustion and vulnerability rarely seen by anyone. His voice was low when he spoke. "I taught you to be strong, Ike. I taught you never to bend. And now you bend for caution?" Eisenhower stood quietly, letting the words settle before answering. "No, sir. I bend for life. Because once you have seen boys too young to shave die in your arms, you learn that time is more powerful than glory." The silence after that felt endless. MacArthur's face softened, not in agreement, but in recognition. For the first time, he understood that Eisenhower was no longer a student. He was a leader, standing firmly in the convictions that he himself had helped shape. Then MacArthur spoke the words that history seldom quotes, but those who heard them never forgot. He looked into Eisenhower's eyes and said slowly, "I may never agree with your choice, but I cannot deny your courage." You stood against the weight of my command, and there are few men alive who would dare do that. I have commanded armies across oceans, but I have never stood across from someone who could deny me without tremble. Eisenhower lowered his gaze, humbled not by victory, but by the respect that appeared unexpectedly like sunlight through clouds. MacArthur continued, voice heavy with the sincerity of a man revealing his heart. If destiny proves you right, I will stand beside you. If it proves you wrong, I will carry the burden with you. The war did move forward, and Eisenhower's strategy eventually saved countless lives, proving that patience and planning were not weakness, but strength. History would later honor both men differently, but with equal reverence. Eisenhower rose to become President of the United States, carrying his philosophy of peace and restraint into the highest office. MacArthur remained a military legend, remembered for unmatched bravery and boldness. Though their beliefs diverged, their love for their country never did. Years later, Arthur was asked to reflect on Eisenhower, and he said something that silenced the room. Ike was the only man I ever commanded who became strong enough to stand against me, and that is why he became the leader the world needed. In the end, what MacArthur said when Eisenhower refused his orders was not simply criticism, anger, or challenge. It was the beginning of respect between two giants whose conflict shaped the course of history. Their confrontation was not a story of enemies, but of two men who loved their nation so deeply that they were willing to stand alone in order to save it. And the world would forever remember that true greatness is not built on agreement. It is built on the courage to choose principle over pride, even when the cost is high.